The vast and unforgiving expanse of the Kansas Territory seemed to tilt violently on its axis, spinning into a dizzying blur of ochre dust and blinding white sky before settling into a terrifying, inverted reality for Lydia Moore. She had not even possessed the breath to scream before the rough hemp rope cinched tight around her ankles, biting into the tender flesh with the ferocity of a steel trap, and she was hauled upward into the suffocating heat of the midday sun. Suspended there, swaying gently like a grotesque wind chime from the weathered crossbeam of the drying rack, Lydia felt the blood rushing to her head in a heavy, throbbing tide that made her ears ring and her vision swim with panicked spots of light. Her skirts had tumbled down around her waist and shoulders, leaving her exposed to the searing wind and the abrasive grit of the prairie, a humiliation that burned hotter than the sun itself. It was a punishment born of madness, the culmination of a morning that had started with spilled coffee and ended with her husband Tom finally snapping the fragile tether of his sanity. The townsfolk of Dodge City knew Tom Moore as a man of dark moods and quick temper, but they saw only the mask he wore in the saloons. They did not see the demon that emerged behind closed doors, the man whose eyes glazed over with the sheen of cheap whiskey until he looked at his wife not as a partner, but as a possession to be broken. He had left her there, dangling in the oppressive silence of the plains with a cruel warning that movement would only tighten the knots before he mounted his horse and rode toward the hazy mirage of the town, leaving her to die or go mad in the solitude. Time lost all meaning as Lydia hung there, the agony in her ankles transforming from a sharp sting to a dull, grinding fire that radiated up her legs, while the pressure in her skull built to an intolerable crescendo. Every breath was a labor, fighting against the pull of gravity, and the thirst that clawed at her throat tasted of copper and despair. The horizon was a jagged line of heat waves, and somewhere in that shimmering distance she hallucinated salvation, only to realize it was just the wind playing tricks on the buffalo grass. She was drifting in and out of consciousness, her mind retreating to a place of numbness to escape the pain, when the rhythmic thud of hooves vibrated through the ground and up the wooden post she was tied to. Fear spiked through her confused mind. Had Tom returned to finish her off, to escalate his torture? But as the rider emerged from the veil of dust, the silhouette was wrong. The rider sat tall and steady, lacking the erratic, angry posture of her husband. It was Ethan Walker. He was a neighbor, a man of few words and stoic kindness, whose ranch bordered theirs. He was a man Tom hated with a baseless, jealous fury simply because Ethan possessed a quiet dignity that Tom could never counterfeit. As Ethan drew closer, the horror on his face was visible even through Lydia's inverted, tear-blurred vision. He reined in his horse with a sharp intake of breath, the animal dancing nervously as if it sensed the malice lingering in the air. Ethan moved with the deliberate, calming precision of a man accustomed to handling startled livestock, sliding from his saddle and approaching the torture device with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the violence that had put Lydia there. He did not waste time with unnecessary questions that would only drain her strength. He simply spoke her name, his voice a low rumble that anchored her drifting consciousness back to the earth. The predicament was delicate. To cut her down without causing her to crash headfirst into the hard-packed dirt required strength and leverage. He stepped in close, his presence a sudden wall of shade against the relentless sun, and for a fleeting moment, Lydia felt a flash of shame at her predicament, her vulnerability on full display. Ethan, however, possessed a gaze that held no judgment, only a focused, grim determination to save her. He braced her weight with one strong arm, his shoulder taking the burden of her body, while his other hand drew a knife that glinted silver in the light. He had to work intimately close, his hand brushing against her leg to find the purchase for the blade between the rope and her skin, a proximity that in any other circumstance would be a scandal. But here, in the crucible of survival, was a holy act of mercy. With a deft slice, the tension snapped. Lydia collapsed into his waiting grasp, not hitting the ground but falling into the safety of his arms. He lowered her slowly, allowing the blood to redistribute, holding her steady as she gasped, the world slowly righting itself, though the ground beneath her felt as unsteady as a ship's deck in a storm. The recovery was slow and agonizing, filled with the pins and needles of returning circulation and the overwhelming emotional crash that follows a brush with death. Ethan tended to her with a solicitude that frightened her, for she was unused to being treated with value. He offered his canteen, his large calloused hands trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from the suppressed rage he felt on her behalf. They sat in the shadow of the barn, the silence between them heavy with unspoken truths, until the silence was shattered by the thunder of returning hooves. Tom had come back. Perhaps he had forgotten something, or perhaps his cruelty required an audience. But when he saw Ethan standing over his wife, the jealousy that had been simmering in his gut boiled over into a volcanic rage. Tom leapt from his horse, his face twisted into a mask of hate, shouting accusations that were as vile as they were untrue. He saw not a rescue, but a betrayal. Lydia shrank back, the old conditioning of fear taking over. But Ethan did not flinch. He stood like a granite boulder in the middle of a rushing river, placing himself between the abuser and his victim. When Tom lunged, expecting the world to cower as it usually did, he found himself checked by a force he hadn't anticipated. Ethan didn't strike him, he merely held his ground and delivered a warning in a voice like cold iron, telling Tom that brutality was the mark of a weak man, a coward trying to feel big. The word struck Tom harder than a fist, wounding his pride in a way that guaranteed this confrontation was far from over. Nightfall brought no relief, only a thick, suffocating tension that draped over the prairie like a funeral shroud. Tom had ridden off after the confrontation, his ego bruised and his mind poisoning itself with vindictive thoughts, while Ethan had taken Lydia to the safety of his own ranch, knowing that the Moore house was no longer a home, but a hunting ground. Ethan knew the nature of men like Tom. They did not forgive, and they certainly did not forget perceived slights. As the moon rose, casting long, skeletal shadows across the yard, Ethan prepared. He checked the latches on the doors and checked his firearms, though he prayed it wouldn't come to gunplay. The attack came not with stealth, but with the brazen arrogance of men who believe they own the night. It wasn't just Tom. He had recruited 2 drinking companions, men with loose morals and heavy fists, to help him reclaim his property. They rode into Ethan's yard with torches and shouts circling the house like wolves. Ethan stepped out onto the porch to meet them, unarmed but unafraid, hoping to talk them down, to appeal to whatever scrap of humanity they had left. But the scent of whiskey and violence was too strong. When the first punch was thrown, the yard erupted into chaos. Ethan fought with the desperate efficiency of a man protecting something sacred, moving through the swirling dust and torchlight, trading blows with 3 men who sought to break him. It was a brutal, ugly melee, the sound of flesh striking flesh echoing against the barn walls, a testament to the primal struggle between tyranny and decency. From the window of the cabin, Lydia watched the violence unfold, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. For years, she'd been the spectator of her own life, paralyzed by the fear of what Tom might do. But seeing Ethan, a man who owed her nothing yet, gave her everything, being beaten down for her sake ignited a spark deep within her soul. The fear didn't vanish, but it was eclipsed by a fierce, blinding resolve. She would not be the victim tonight. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, the metal cold and solid in her grip, and ran out into the chaotic swirling dust of the yard. The scene was a nightmare of shadows and grunts. Ethan was on his knees, bloodied but unyielding, while Tom prepared to deliver a crushing blow. Lydia screamed, a sound that tore from the very bottom of her lungs, and swung the iron bar with all her might, striking Tom across the shoulder. The shock of it froze the men. In that stunned silence, the sound of approaching riders cut through the night. The sheriff and his deputies, alerted by the commotion and the testimony of neighbors who had seen enough. The law descended upon the ranch, and for the first time in his life, Tom Moore found that his fists could not buy his way out of consequences. As the handcuffs clicked around her husband's wrists, Lydia dropped the iron poker, her hands shaking, and looked at Ethan. Battered and bruised, he offered her a weary, bloody smile. They both knew the storm had finally broken. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings and healing, a slow unraveling of the knots that had bound Lydia's life for so long. The courtroom in Dodge City was packed to the rafters, the air thick with the smell of damp wool and tobacco as the town came to witness the reckoning. Lydia took the stand, her voice trembling at first, but gaining strength as she looked at Ethan sitting in the gallery, his presence a silent anchor. She spoke the truth of her marriage, detailing the years of hidden bruises and silent screams, stripping away the facade Tom had carefully maintained. The testimony of the doctor, coupled with the eyewitness accounts of the hanging and the assault at Ethan's ranch, painted a picture so damning that even Tom's expensive lawyer could not scrub away the stain. The judge's gavel fell with the finality of a guillotine, granting the divorce and sentencing Tom to a lengthy prison term for his assault. When Lydia walked out of the courthouse, the air tasted different, cleaner, sweeter. She was no longer Lydia Moore, the victim. She was a woman who had walked through fire and survived. Ethan was waiting for her on the steps, his hat in his hand. He didn't rush her, didn't claim her. He simply offered to walk her home. As they moved together down the boardwalk, the vast Kansas sky opened up above them, no longer a furnace of oppression, but a canvas of infinite possibility, stretching out toward a future they would now write together.